Now I'm going to talk a bit about my preferred method for post-flop training. And there's a number of tools available to accomplish this. Lucid GTO is the one that I use the most personally, but the newest version of PioSolver has a training tool built in. A lot of the web solvers that I've described in this course also offer a training tool that's attached to the web solver. The most important thing, as I've said elsewhere, is to be training with the same material that you're studying deeply. So whatever it is that we're trying to ingrain into our strategy, into our practical skill set, is the same stuff that we should be looking at more carefully when we sit down to study theory. What Lucid GTO does is it integrates with your PioSolver library. They offer Cloud Sims as well, if you don't want to use your own sims. But for me, because I have a lot of my study material built custom through PioSolver, it was a really useful add-on that made sense so that I could train my library of sims. So the main reason we're here to use trainers is practical skill development. I've said it before, but I'll just emphasize again that a lot of what we study theoretically is something that we're convinced that we know better than we do. And when we sit down and have time to think, look at a solution, look at our reference material, whatever, maybe we're talking strategy with a friend, everything can feel very crystal. And then the next day or that evening or whatever, you can sit down and play that spot and completely miss the mark on execution and just feel confused as to why you're not playing the way that you know you can play. And training tools are the most effective antidote to that problem. So if it's not something that you're doing already, it's absolutely mandatory, in my opinion, for a pro poker player or for just a serious poker player in general to practice what they study. Like I said, you can drill your own sims. I think this is really key to making everything synchronous. You don't want the trainer to be telling you that your play was not GTO or that you made an EV mistake when your other study material is telling you the opposite. So by training the exact same solutions that you're studying in your theory sessions, you avoid any possibility of conflict in information. And it's not important. I mean, it's sort of important, but executing a pretty good solution accurately is so much better than having the perfect solution or the perfect information. What I should say is it's less important for your material to be perfect than it is for you to integrate the material you're studying effectively. So I would emphasize consistency in execution over having the perfect training material. And I think a lot of people they just get bogged down in the details of making sure their sims are top notch and making sure that their material is perfect. And this sort of perfectionist desire can get in the way of just being really sharp with whatever material you have, because almost certainly, even if your sims are relatively low accuracy, it's still extremely good information to be basing your play off of. Sure, it's maybe not the best, but in 99% of games, that's not going to matter as much as just being consistent and knowing your stuff. So the other points that I've written here would be best explained, I think, if we looked together at some of the features that Lucid GTO specifically has. So I noted the benefit of being able to recalculate your bet sizes. I just want to show a quick example of that. So the way that the way that this program functions is that you connect your local sims, for example, this 100 big blind heads up 3-bet pot script that I have saved on my hard drive. And once you connect those sims, you can create customized drills that read those sims and generate a more specific scenario within the full solution that you can practice. So when you're creating that drill, if I was to load this 100 big blind 3-bet pot, I would have the option to use the default sizes that are in the simulation itself that I've originally set up. And that might, depending on how you set up your sims, be quite a lot of options. Or you could set up customized turn and river adjustments in Lucid because they have the PioSolver engine built into the program, which allows them to recalculate turns or rivers on the fly. You can't do this for flops, but you could do this for turns or rivers. So if I was to open up this tool, you can see how I've got like a river block or jam strategy simplified here. For river out of position, you can see there's very few options, just a 25% bet size and an all-in bet size. And I was using this for a river probing drill where I wanted to significantly trim down the number of options that it was giving me on the river to practice a more simplified strategy that I thought was going to be effective for that spot. So this is a really powerful tool in conjunction with some of the simplification theory that I like to use. So if we start with a more complicated sim that has a lot of bet sizes, and then we do some theoretical study to decide, in this particular spot, I can get away with just a couple of bet sizes on the river or just one bet size on the turn. Well, now Lucid has given us the option to create a drill just for that node to simplify the bet sizing strategy within the sims without having to recalculate all the work that you've done in the first place. In PioSolver, you can just have it done on the fly in your trainer. The last strength that I highlighted for this tool is the ability to review your mistakes. And this can be done in a variety of different ways depending on the goal of your training session. But just to show you the functionality really quickly, if we click through a few hands in this 3-bet pot simulation that I was showing you before, I can maybe just make a mistake that I know is not going to be great. So anytime you make an error above a certain threshold that you've set, I have 0.1 big blinds set as the threshold. I think that's the default. If you've made a mistake and you want to understand why this was a mistake, you can see there's not a whole lot of information available on the screen while you're playing to tell you what caused the mistake or how big of a mistake it is compared to your other options. So if you open the replayer, you're going to see is honestly a lot like PioSolver's interface, which I like a lot because the whole point of me using this particular program is its compatibility with the main post-flop solver that I'm using. So I can go back. These are all the hands that you saw me play just now in that extremely short session. But any hands that you play throughout the session would populate in this replayer here. And now you can go back and navigate through the hands you played and see right in here the full range strategy and the specific hand strategy that you had. And if you really want to get to the bottom of what's happening here, you can always, there's a hyperlink here to PioSolver that will just open the full sim in PioSolver if you want to look at, for example, some of the nodes that you didn't select in the trainer more closely. Now, of course, I do want to talk about some of the weaknesses of this program or these types of programs in general. Lucid GTO specifically has the limitation of having not a lot of flexibility outside of the use of PioSolver. So if you're not someone who uses PioSolver primarily, I don't know that this is the program that I would recommend for you. If you use a web solver as your main study tool, for example, GTO Wizard or Odin or any of these programs that have trainers built in to go along with the sim library, then I certainly think just using the trainer that's built into that sim library is the logical choice. There are also some standalone trainers like DTO that I like a lot for tournaments. Of course, the limitation there is now you're paying double for maybe like a web solver or one of those browsers, and you're paying for the trainer. Whereas a lot of the programs that I mentioned before have both for one price. So there's a lot of customization that you could do there. But Lucid GTO specifically To be honest, I haven't played with their cloud sims a whole lot. For an extra $20 a month, you do get access to a cloud library. I think they have quite a lot of short stacking spots and some heads up cache. So depending on what your needs are, perhaps if you don't need a huge library, if you're not a tournament player, if you're more of like if you're a spin and go player, I want to say they have a pretty good library for you. And if you're a 100 big blind heads up player, I think they have a good library for you. But anything more than that, and I would say that there's some limitations in this program. Saying it's ideal for post flop and for heads up only, I think this is a limitation of pretty much every trainer on the market that I'm describing here, with the exception maybe of DTO that now has a 3-way trainer. But that's quite a limited library of solutions at the moment. This is just kind of what the typical solver offers right now. Almost all of them are ideal for post flop. Almost all of them are heads up only. I think that if you are looking for a solution outside of that realm, you're very likely, at least at the time of recording, going to need a custom program, something really expensive, or you're more likely better off just talking with other professionals or with your peers about the way that they approach those situations. Programs are certainly getting better at solving multi-way, both pre-flop and post-flop, but I think they still have quite a ways to go. So the scenarios in which you can train are certainly limited to, when I say heads up, I don't mean like heads up format. I just mean 2 players to the flop. So that could be any game, cash or tournament, any positions, any pre-flop ranges, but not 3-way to the flop or any post-flop scenario. When I mentioned difficulty in logging results, this is just a feature that I hope that Lucid will add at some point. I think it's actually in their backlog. But you might have seen when I was browsing through the replayer, I'll just pull it up, that you can see your EVBB mistakes in a column next to all the hands that you played. But as far as I know at the moment, the only way to look through these mistakes is during the session or immediately after the session, like while the program's still open. But I would love to add some kind of scorekeeping database to these programs or to this program specifically, at least for my personal gain. That would be great, because being able to track your improvement over time is really valuable. And in the way that I've used this program thus far, I've had to manually track it. I do think they have something, I'll just show you here. They have this EVBB history, and maybe I'll find out after recording that I'm mistaken about the limitations of looking up your results. But as far as I've seen now, you can kind of see over time, there's a graph that builds up. This database doesn't have many hands in it, but it would be really beneficial. I know that I've talked with some of my students about this, to be able to look, let's say, over weeks or over months at your progress in specific drills, so that you could categorize how far you've come in those different areas and maybe quantify when you're going to stop training that particular spot and move on to another one. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the pitfalls that I see some of my students or other players running into when using programs like this. A fear of blunders is a real mental block, I think, or just in the way of unlocking the true benefits of training. And I have worked with some people who are surprisingly impervious to the sort of negative feedback that you sometimes get. You saw when I was playing earlier, if you make an error, a window pops up and stops you and says, "Hold on, you've made a pretty large mistake," and that can be discouraging for some people. And I think that slows down not only the volume that some players are willing to put into the trainer, but it also just literally slows down the speed of their session, which I've also written here as a pitfall, slow training. So I'll just talk about that in general. When we're playing an online session especially, but even when we're playing live, we don't really get the space to reminisce or mull over our mistakes without being forced to continue to play. And the environment that you're in a casino or at the online table is pushing you forward into new scenarios, regardless of how long you want to, sit back and think about the mistake that you made earlier. So something that I strongly recommend is to make your training as similar to your playing environment as possible, or at least the training with this type of program. Not necessarily every method of training. I think I talk in the Preflop Academy video about using final table or ICM scenarios in a more slow, deliberate method. But when we're talking about going through routine post-flop or pre-flop situations with a trainer, we want those decisions to mimic the environment in which we're making those decisions for money. So playing slowly, and how I mean is like clicking the overbet, having the window pop up that says you've made a blunder, and then just stopping your session right there, opening up the sim and spending 5-10 minutes browsing through, looking for the answer. Why did I make that mistake? How did that mistake happen? And this really cuts into the, like, now you've stopped training for 10 minutes. Maybe another 5 minutes will go by before you get back in and restart your session. And you're probably going to play 3 or 4 more hands until that happens again. That's just the reality of training, is that the computer is much better than you. You're going to blunder often. You're going to get pop-ups frequently that tell you you've made an error. And it's important not to let that phase you. It's important to continue to play through your session and review those mistakes at a separate time, in my opinion. So what I strongly recommend is maybe to turn off the pop-up or just to ignore the pop-up for some predetermined period of time. Let's say 50 hands, 100 hands, 20 minutes, whatever's comfortable for you. You can toy around with the specifics. And only once that duration has completed, once you've played enough hands for you to feel like, exhausted or just comfortable with how much training you've done, now we stop and we either review immediately afterwards or we take a break and then come back and review in a slower way, in a deliberate way. But we need to separate those two techniques. We need to separate the game-like training from the slow, deliberate study. So a fear of blunders or just a habit of looking up the solution right away as soon as we make the mistake is a really bad habit that I strongly encourage you to plan around or just to avoid in general. Now, drawing conclusions too rapidly. This is, you could do this with looking at sims. You could do this with training. Solutions are complicated, and I just encourage you not to decide after a short period of time that you've figured out that situation. I've made this mistake many times in many different areas of the game, and I think it's important to continue to return to seemingly boring situations or seemingly routine situations like flop c-betting, flop check raising, pre-flop facing a raise, pre-flop opening, and come back to it often with a fresh mind and look to learn something new, or at least challenge the things that you believe you already know. Because very often you'll find that whatever conclusions you drew previously about the pattern you thought you recognized, there's a little more to it, most likely. And it's okay to draw conclusions, of course, but you just don't want to be so sure of yourself based on 5, 10, or even 100 simulation results. You want to stick with this information for a long time before you decide that you know what's really going on. And aimless gameplay, this is pretty much the difference. I'll maybe show you briefly. This is the difference between playing a scenario without purpose and playing a scenario with purpose. So this is key to the format of this course and to the overarching ideas here. I just want to show you 2 examples. The first drill that I have here, I'll maybe just filter. First drill that I have here is the entire 100 big blind 3-bet pot game tree that essentially from start to finish, you'll see it loading here. From start to finish, it's going to play you through the simulations, and it's going to randomly assign you to out of position or in position. Now, I've done a little bit of targeting here, right? I've decided that 100 big blind heads up 3-bet pot is what I want to practice. That's great. And I think this is a good starting point for a lot of people. So if you've never even used a trainer before and you haven't done a full detailed evaluation before, if this whole process is a little bit intimidating, this is a perfectly reasonable place to start. But for a lot of you who I know have already used trainers before, have already studied a bit before, moving beyond this kind of generic training is going to be the next step for you. So I could open this up and I could just start playing around, and I could play a pretty reasonable long session, probably not make too many egregious mistakes, and feel pretty comfortable that I'm learning something. I'm playing through hands. Playing through hands is fun. Great. I took a near perfect line there. I could pat myself on the back and say, yeah, I'm really understanding this. And I could play through a whole bunch of scenarios where, I'm not really sure why I'm betting 6.5 sometimes and checking sometimes, but that's fine. The program didn't yell at me, right? I didn't make any big mistakes. Okay, well, here we made a big mistake. But now I've stopped myself. Maybe I'm making the previous mistake that I mentioned of researching what happened in this situation that led to my blunder. Well, now I'm in the check, overbet river line. And just by the nature of how this hand played out, the program has now decided for me that the spot I'm going to focus on is check down to the river when an ace comes, and we're thinking about overbetting. And okay, why is betting 2/3 pot better than overbetting? Is this really what I wanted to work on today? I didn't, you might end up spending 10 or 15 minutes now. And this wasn't planned before recording this video either, but just was check down to the river and then get the ace the most important thing I could be working on right now? Or did I really need to be focusing on how to play versus a flop stab when I check? Because the computer decided not to stab this time. But what I want to show you is a more specific version of this drill facing flop float. So what I've done is I've changed the setup, and I'm not going to walk through every detail of how to use it, but it's pretty straightforward. When you're setting up the drill, you can specify, I'm only going to be out of position. I'm going to start the hand by checking the flop. I'm only going to play to the end of the flop, and I'm always going to face a bet. So now I can open a targeted drill for a situation that I know I needed to study. And it's going to throw me into this scenario with all sorts of different hands, all within the pre-flop range, of course. But it's going to throw me into this scenario where now I'm forced to deal with the situation I'm uncomfortable with, or that I've decided is the focus for today. And I can get in a high volume of reps. Look, a mistake right off the bat, which is perfect. I'm going to play through way more hands very quickly because I've been thrown into this situation specifically. And you see every time it's the same. I'm facing a small flop bet. I've always checked. I'm always 100 big blinds deep. I've really narrowed down exactly what I'm dealing with today, what the focus is for this session. And as a result, I'm going to be really efficient. I could probably play 100 hands in 15 minutes. And at the end of those 15 minutes, I can take a quick break. And then I can go back and I can open the replayer here. And I can go through and study only the biggest mistakes, or as many of the mistakes as I want, but only the biggest mistakes that I made versus in position 30% flop float. And this is a far more achievable project for my training. And I'm going to get much, much better, much faster at something specific and actionable. So huge, huge improvement, I think, over the aimless full hand study. There's a place for that. There's nothing wrong with just getting some hands in if that's what you feel like you want to do today. But this whole process that I'm taking you through in identifying specific problem areas and then coming up with a training regimen or a study regimen for those specific areas, this is the key difference maker in using your trainer. So to sum up, as usual, just run you through the best practices. Drill your weaknesses. This is what I've just been talking about. We really want to specify what areas we are coming to the trainer to address, and then focus specifically on one of those areas and make real progress in that area in every individual session. Setting EV mistake targets. I didn't talk about this specifically, but you could see how easy it is in the program to benchmark where you're starting from. You could play 100 hands and log your results to benchmark a starting point. And then every time you come back to that situation, you can try and edge your mistakes a little bit closer to equilibrium. I found in heads up pots, well, in heads up no limit, I should say, I found that making 10 big blinds per 100, or what is that, 0.1 big blinds per hand, I found that was a reasonable threshold for single raise pots. And I found that 0.3 big blinds per hand was a reasonable threshold for 3-bet pots. Now that's on the full tree. So starting from flop to river, playing full hands where you could make mistakes on any street. When you shrink it down in the way that I was just describing for, flop only when facing an imposition stab, your mistakes can be quite small. And you can get total EV loss extremely close to zero in individual nodes. So for that reason, I really like, again, the target setting and the specific drilling of individual nodes, because you can set this target as close to zero as you like, depending on how your performance is at the beginning. And as I mentioned near the beginning, and I'll continue to harp on this point, you want your training to emulate real gameplay. So if you're an online player and you're going to be four-tabling heads up, you should be four-tabling your trainer at least some of the time. If you're a live player and the game is really slow for you, play slow. Like why speed through the trainer just because you're bored or just because maybe you're lacking focus when you're on the computer instead of at the table? You need to slow down to the pace of your actual play when you are probably not giving hands the same amount of thought, or at least you're not going through the same process that you would be going through at the live table if you're rapid playing, right? If you're playing off of instinct. Because when you're sitting at the table, you're going to be forced to play slower, and that's going to change the way you think. So you really want to do whatever you can to put yourself in the same environment that you're training for and emulate that with this program.